Natalia and Artem have been married for more than 10 years. Their life seemed ideal: stability, joint plans for the future, harmony in the family home. But recently, Artem began to notice alarming changes in his wife's behavior. Natalia became more remote, often excused herself by being late outside the house, and her phone was constantly under close control. One evening, Natalia returned home unusually cheerful. To Artem's question about the reason for the delay, she answered that she met an old friend and spent time with her over coffee. But Artyom noticed that lipstick was smeared on his wife's lips, and it seemed strange. He had never heard of this friend before. Suspicions began to prevail, and Artem decided to start his own investigation. He wanted to know if his fears had a basis, or if it was all just his imagination. The next morning, Artem began to act. He decided to check Natalia's phone, but it turned out to be not so easy. Her phone was password protected, and she was in no hurry to leave it unattended. Therefore, Artem decided to act differently. He remembered the times when Natalia began to linger and decided to follow her. On Friday evening, when she said she was going to meet a friend, Artem secretly followed her. His heart was pounding when he saw Natalia get into the taxi. He also quickly called a car and asked the driver to keep his distance. A taxi brought Natalia to an elite restaurant in the city center. Artem remained outside, watching through the window. Soon, Natalia was joined by an unfamiliar man. They sat at the table, drank wine, and talked like old friends. Artyom watched her laugh and flirt. Something clearly went beyond friendly relations. This discovery was a shock for him. Hundreds of thoughts flashed through my head. Is Natalia really cheating? What to do next? Deciding not to act impulsively, he returned home to consider his next steps. In the following days, Artyom decided to proceed cautiously. He hired a private detective to find out more about the man Natalia met at the restaurant. While the detective was gathering information, Artyom tried to behave as usual so as not to arouse his wife's suspicions. The detective quickly collected the necessary data. The man's name was Maxim. He was a successful businessman who, according to the detective, had previously had relationships with married women. The more Artem learned, the harder it was for him to hold back his emotions. Everything that he was afraid to find out gradually became obvious. The evening came when Artem decided that it was time to talk. He didn't want to play the role of a man who knows nothing anymore. When Natalia returned home later than usual, Artem was sitting in the living room, waiting for her. His gaze was calm, but cold. "We need to talk," he said as she entered the room. "What happened?" Natalia stopped, seeing his serious expression. "I want you to answer honestly. Who is Maxim?" For a moment, there was silence in the room. Natalia turned pale and her eyes filled with fear. She tried to find words, but Artyom did not give her the opportunity to evade. "I saw you in the restaurant. You can't deny it. I want to know the truth." Natalia lowered her head, realizing that everything's secret had become clear. She answered quietly, "It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" Artyom raised his voice. His indignation broke out. "Then explain what it is! Why are you dating him behind my back?" Natalia sighed and, it seems, finally decided to confess. "It started by accident. We met at an event and I don't know how it happened. It was a mistake, but Artem, I love you." The words sounded empty to Artem. He sat looking at his wife and wondered how things had gotten so far. For him, this was the moment when the illusion of their marriage shattered into small fragments. Now he had to decide if anything could be saved or if this was the end. Artem could not find peace. His soul was filled with anger and despair. He decided that he would not allow this situation to remain without consequences. Natalia apologized, but her words did not change anything. Artem realized that he wanted to meet with Maxim in person to find out everything. He called Maxim, introducing himself as Natalia's acquaintance, and arranged for him to meet on the outskirts of the city on a hill with a wonderful view of the valley. Maxim agreed, not suspecting that this meeting could be dangerous. In the evening, Artem arrived on the hill first. He stood at the edge of the cliff, looking down at the bleak landscape. His heart was beating faster at the thought of what he was about to do. Soon, Maxim drove up in a black car and approached Artem. "Are you Artem?" asked Maxim, cautiously looking at the man in front of him. "Yes, it's me," answered Artem, trying to keep himself in his hands. "We have to talk." "About what?" Maxim tried to keep his confidence, but the nervousness in his voice betrayed him. Artem took a few steps closer. About Natalia, you destroyed my family. Is that not enough for you? Listen, Maxim began, raising his hands in a protective gesture. It wasn't serious. I didn't mean to offend anyone. Didn't want to? Artem burst into a scream. You betrayed me! You ruined our life! Maxim took a step back, seeing that Artem was losing control. But this only pushed Artem to decisive action. He grabbed Maxim by the collar and pushed him closer to the edge of the cliff. Thought it was just a game, Artyom exclaimed, his hands shaking from tension. Did you think that everything would remain without consequences? Stop, Maxim begged, trying to free himself. We can solve it in another way. But for Artem, there were no other solutions. One thought rang in his head. He deserves it! Suddenly, with one strong push, he threw Maxim down. Maxim's body flew into the abyss, and his screams were drowned out by the wind. Artem stood on the edge, looking down. Everything happened so quickly that he did not have time to fully realize what he had done. My heart was beating wildly, and my hands were still shaking. But at the same time, he felt a strange sense of relief. He returned to the car and drove home. Artem returned home late at night. Everything around seemed unreal. He sat in the living room in the dark, trying to organize his thoughts. He was overcome with a strange sense of relief. But at the same time, the burden of guilt began to gradually press down on him. Artem understood that he had committed an irreparable crime. Natalia noticed his condition the next morning. She tried to speak, but Artyom answered only briefly and avoided her gaze. He didn't know if he could look her in the eyes again after what he had done. The first warning signs soon appeared. The police found Maxim's car in the parking lot near the hill, but the man himself was not there. His friends reported him missing. The investigation began, and this made Artem feel that the noose around him was gradually tightening. One of the detectives came to Artem's home to ask a few questions. Did you know Maxim? Asked the officer, carefully looking into Artem's face. No, I didn't know, quickly answered Artem, trying to look confident. Why do you ask? We know that he's been dealing with your wife lately, said the detective, studying Artem's reaction. Did you notice anything suspicious? No, he repeated, pretending to be surprised. Natalia did not tell me anything. Natalia also began to notice that Artem had become withdrawn and anxious. She asked him directly, What's wrong with you? You have changed. Did something happen? No, nothing, he answered shortly, but her look showed that she did not believe. Artem understood that his behavior could arouse suspicion and tried to behave more naturally, but the thought that the police could get to the truth did not give him peace. A few days later, the police announced that they had found Maxim's body at the bottom of the hill. The death was officially ruled an accident, but many questions remained. Artem understood that now he could be safe if he remained careful. Artyom tried to return to normal life, but every time he closed his eyes, a moment on the hill appeared before him. He clearly heard Maxim's cry, saw his confused face. The anger that had driven him then was replaced by guilt and shame. One evening, when Natalia came into the living room, Artem was sitting with a glass of whiskey in his hands. She no longer asked what was wrong with him because she knew that he would not tell the truth. But now everything has changed. I know you're hiding something, she said. Her voice was calm but insistent. You are not the same as before. What did you do? Artem looked at her. Pain and despair were visible in his eyes. Do you want to know the truth? He asked, barely holding back tears. Good. I'll tell you, I met with Maxim. I spoke with him, but he's not coming back. Natalia froze as if a lightning strike had chained her to her place. What do you mean? What did you do? Her voice rose, but she couldn't believe what she was hearing. I pushed him, whispered Artem. It was an accident, or maybe not. I don't know. I was furious. He stood on the edge, and I just couldn't stop. Natalia grabbed her head, her face turned pale. She could barely speak. Do you understand what that means? The police, they recognized it as an accident, Artyom interrupted her. Nobody knows anything, but I know, and you know. I can't hide it anymore. The next day, Natalia could not find a place for herself. Her emotions fluctuated between shock, anger, and despair. She realized that now she too was becoming a part of this dark secret. Her own guilt that her betrayal had led to such an ending haunted her. Artem, meanwhile, began to think about even more radical steps. He decided that he could not go on living like this. Should he have repented? Is there a way to clear the conscience in another way? A few weeks later, the police received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end of the line said only one thing. Maxim did not fall alone. He was pushed. The police investigation began with renewed vigor. Detectives returned to the testimony of Maxim's friends and relatives, analyzing his last contacts. The name of Artem, which had not previously appeared in the investigation, suddenly became of interest to the investigators. Natalia noticed how Artyom was becoming more and more anxious, but now she herself could not remain calm. One evening, Artyom got a call from the police. "Mr. Artem, we would like you to come to the station for a further conversation," said the detective. "We have several questions." These words made Artem's heart freeze. He understood that everything was going to reveal. There were only two options left: continue to deny or confess. "Okay, I'll come tomorrow," he answered, trying to remain calm. That night, he decided to talk to Natalia. She sat in the kitchen, nervously going through her hands. "Did you make that call?" Artem asked directly. She looked up, her eyes filled with pain. "No!" "But I wanted to do it," she said. "I can no longer live with this secret. She destroys me, but I didn't know how—" "Someone knows, Natalia, and now the police suspect me," he said with despair in his voice. Natalia was silent. The next day, Artem came to the branch. He was met by a detective, the same one who was already at his house. "You knew Maxim, right?" He began the conversation, unfolding the papers on the table. "No, I didn't know him," answered Artem, but his voice was shaking. "And what about this meeting on the hill?" asked the detective, carefully looking at Artem. "We received information that you were there that evening." Artem felt a cold sweat run down his back. He couldn't take the pressure anymore. "Yes, I was there," he suddenly admitted. "But it was a dispute. I didn't want to. I just pushed him and he fell." Artem's confession shocked the police. He was arrested on charges of involuntary manslaughter. Natalia stayed at home, broken and devastated. She understood that everything that happened was the result of her betrayal. She lost her husband, not even because of his death, but because of her own weakness and mistakes. At the court, Artem told everything as it was, without trying to justify himself. The court took into account his confession, but also took into account his emotional state. He was sentenced to several years in prison. For Natalia, this was the end of her former life. She was left alone, burdened with guilt and the burden of a broken marriage. For Artem, it was a test that he hoped would end someday. But their life together could never return to the former. Months passed. Artem, while in prison, felt the full weight of his crime. He often thought back to that moment on the hill, trying to figure out if he could have acted differently. Two forces were fighting in his soul. One reminded him of the injustice he experienced because of Natalia's betrayal, the other of the fact that he had become a murderer. In order not to lose himself completely, Artem began to write. In his records, he confessed to himself, pondered every mistake, analyzed his emotions. He even wrote a letter to Natalia, but hesitated for a long time whether to send it. Meanwhile, Natalia tried to rebuild her life, but it was difficult. She was tormented by the guilt that it was her betrayal that became the catalyst for the tragedy. She stayed in their house, but memories of the past haunted her every step of the way. People who used to know her family now looked at her with sympathy or condemnation. One day, she received a letter from Artem. As she opened the envelope, she felt mixed emotions: fear, pain, and hope. The letter read, "Natalia, I thought for a long time whether I should write to you. But the silence destroys me as much as the memories of that evening. I do not justify myself. I did what I did and I have to answer for it. But I want you to know that despite everything, I don't hate you. Yes, I was angry, I was betrayed, but now I understand that your betrayal could not justify my act. It was my weakness, my inability to control my anger. I am writing to apologize. Not so that you would forgive me, but so that I could forgive myself. I hope you find the strength to continue living. Maybe someday I will find it." Artem. After reading the letter, Natalia cried for a long time. She knew that forgiveness wouldn't change the past, but it might be the first step to the future. A few years later, Artem was released. He looked older, exhausted, but there was something new inside him, a desire to start life from scratch. He moved to another city where no one knew him and started doing volunteer work, helping people who were going through difficult life circumstances. Natalia continued to live alone, but time gradually healed the wounds. She learned to accept her mistakes and live with them. Although they never met again, they both knew that this experience had changed them forever. This story left many questions unanswered. But one thing was clear: life always goes on, even after the deepest upheavals. And everyone chooses how to live on, with hatred or with hope. Adaptation to a new life was not easy for Artyom. People who knew his history treated him with caution. His reputation followed him, even in his new city. But he decided that he would no longer let his past determine his future. Artem got a job at a local library. It was a modest job, but it gave him peace and time to think. He also started conducting classes for young people, where he talked about his mistakes and taught them to avoid decisions made under the influence of emotions. His openness and sincerity gradually began to win respect among local residents. Natalia also tried to change her life. She realized that she could no longer stay in a house that was filled with memories of pain and betrayal. The sale of the house became a symbol of a new beginning for her. She moved to another city, away from everyone who knew her story. Natalia started working in the Center of Psychological Assistance. Her own experience of betrayal and loss helped her understand other people. She became a listener, support for those who were looking for a way out of difficult situations. One day, their paths crossed again. It happened by chance in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, where both were passing through. Natalia noticed Artem first. He sat at the table by the window, looking thoughtful but calm. She hesitated to approach, but decided to risk it. "Artem?" she said, approaching the table. Artyom raised his eyes and froze for a moment when he saw her. Then he barely smiled. "Natalia, how are you?" They sat down together, at first in silence, but then a conversation started. They talked about the past, about their changes, about what this ordeal had taught them. It was a difficult conversation, but it brought relief to both of us. "I'm glad you found your way," Natalia said at the end. "And I'm glad that you're also moving forward," answered Artem. "At least now we can look at it as a lesson and not the end." They said goodbye, realizing that their lives would never cross again as before. But this time they parted without pain or accusations. Each of them had their own path, and they both decided to follow it with hope for the best. After that unexpected meeting, Natalia and Artem decided to keep in touch. At first, they communicated as acquaintances. They shared news about their achievements, work, and changes in life. Artem talked about his charitable foundation, The Way to Light, and Natalia about her lectures and support groups. With each conversation, they became closer. Their conversations began to go beyond professional topics. They shared their feelings, memories, and dreams. Both realized that despite everything, they felt comfortable and safe in communicating with each other. It was strange, but natural at the same time. One evening, after a long phone conversation, Natalia said, "Artem, I am glad that we are talking again. I think it helps both." "And I'm glad," he answered. Perhaps it was a chance that we should not lose. Communication became regular. They began to see each other in person, first at events and then in an informal setting. They discovered each other in a new way. Now without the burden of the past, but with the awareness of all the lessons they had learned. Later, their meetings turned into something more. They realized that the feeling that they lost long ago had reappeared between them. It was not like the love they had felt before. Now it was deeper, based on mutual understanding, trust, and respect. One evening, after another meeting, Artem said, "Natalia, I know that we have been through a lot, and our mistakes cannot be erased, but I think we got a second chance. I want to try again if you want to." Natalia looked at him, her eyes filled with warmth. "I thought about it too, Artem. Maybe we can really build something new better than before." They decided to take their time, but both knew that this was the beginning of a new story. Their connection was not only romantic, but also deeply spiritual. They became partners who helped each other grow and move forward. Months passed, and the relationship between Artyom and Natalia became stronger. They supported each other in their work, helped implement projects, and at the same time built a life together. Their experience has taught them to value sincerity and openness. Artem continued to work on the development of the Path to Light Foundation, and Natalia expanded her lectures and trainings. They even started holding joint events where they told their stories, inspiring others to overcome difficulties and find new meanings. One day, Artem made a proposal to Natalia, which was simple but sincere. "We have come a long way, and I can't imagine my life without you. Are you ready to start this new chapter together? Natalia smiled, her eyes shone with happiness. Yes, Artem, I'm ready. This time, their union was built on trust, respect, and mutual support. They no longer tried to be perfect, but worked to be happy together. Their story proved that even after the deepest upheavals, you can find love and build a future based on new principles and values. A few months after their reunion, Natalia began to feel that her condition had changed. When she went to the doctor, she learned the amazing news. She was pregnant. For her and Artem, it was a pleasant surprise that added new meaning to their lives. At the first ultrasound, they learned another piece of news. Natalia was expecting twins. A boy and a girl. Two little lives that became a symbol of their new beginning. Artyom was filled with joy, hugging Natalia and repeating, "This is a real miracle. We will do everything to make them happy." But happiness was overshadowed by the doctor's words. He explained that the boy is developing more slowly than his sister and that there are serious risks to his health. "We will watch and do our best," said the doctor, but added, "However, there is a possibility that the boy may not survive." These words were a heavy blow for Natalia and Artem. They both fell silent, as if trying to comprehend what they heard. After returning home, they sat together in silence for a long time. Finally, Artem hugged Natalia, pressing her to him. "We must fight," he said. "For him, for both of them. We cannot give up." Natalia nodded, but tears were streaming down her face. She understood that the future of their family depended on these months, which would be the most difficult test of their lives. Every subsequent visit to the doctor was stressful. They carefully listened to all recommendations and did everything possible to support the health of both children. Natalia followed a strict regime, ate right, and tried to keep calm, although it was difficult for her. One evening, Artem said, "Natalia, we must believe. Our boy is fighting, and we are fighting with him. No matter what happens, we did our best." Natalia nodded and smiled for the first time in a long time. Her husband was her support, and this support gave her the strength to move forward. They began to prepare for the birth of twins, although the pain and fear never left them. When choosing names, they settled on Oleksandra for a girl and Markov for a boy. They promised themselves that despite everything, they would create a world full of love and care for their children. But there was always anxiety hanging over their happiness. The doctors gave no guarantees, and every day Natalia prayed that both babies would survive. Artyom also found new strength in himself. He began to spend more time at home, supporting his wife and taking on most of the household chores. When it was time to give birth, Artyom and Natalia held hands, supporting each other. The birth of children was difficult, and doctors fought for each of them. When Natalia gave birth to a girl, they were relieved, but the boy, Marco, was too weak. All the efforts of the doctors could not save him. Artyom, holding his son's small body in his hands, felt a wave of guilt wash over him. There was a thought in his heart that he couldn't overcome. "This is punishment. Punishment for what I did that night. I took a life, and now my life has taken our son." He could not look Natalia in the eyes. While she was holding their daughter, Oleksandra, and crying quietly, Artyom felt broken. He was convinced that it was his past that caused this loss. "It's my fault," he said when they were alone. "If I hadn't done what I did then, our Marco would have been with us." "No, Artem," answered Natalia, although her voice was weak from pain. "It's not your fault. We couldn't have predicted it or changed it. He was with us as much as he could. We should appreciate it. You have already suffered the punishment for your act." But Natalia's words could not calm Artem. He felt that his burden of guilt had become even heavier. His dreams were filled with images of Maxim and Mark, and he could not find a place for himself. After Mark's funeral, they spent a long time trying to recover. Artem devoted all his time to taking care of Oleksandra, trying to find the meaning of life in her smile. Natalia supported him, understanding that he was struggling not only with the loss of his son, but also with his own demons. One evening, sitting next to Oleksandra, who was sleeping peacefully in her crib, Natalia said, "We lost a lot, but we also have a lot. Our daughter is a gift, Artem, and I know Marco would want us to live on for her." Artem was silent for a long time and then nodded. He knew he needed to find a way to forgive himself, even though it seemed almost impossible. But now he had a goal: to become the best father for Oleksandra and carry the memory of Mark in his heart. Months passed. Artem and Natalia gradually returned to life, although the wound from the loss of Mark remained deep. Oleksandra became a source of inspiration and hope for them. Her first smiles, laughs, and steps were small moments of joy that helped them overcome the pain. Artem, despite his difficult emotional state, decided to work on his charity fund again. He felt that helping others could be his way to atone for his mistakes. Natalia supported him in this, while at the same time continuing to work with people who were going through difficult life circumstances. One day, Artem decided that he wanted to do something special for Mark's memory. He proposed to Natalia to create a new department in their help center dedicated to supporting families who have lost children. Natalia agreed, and they called the project Wings of Mark, symbolizing hope even after heavy losses. Artem gave a speech at the opening of the project. For the first time, he spoke openly about his feelings of guilt, about losing Mark and how it changed his life. Our son was with us for a short time, but he left an unforgettable mark in our hearts. His memory gives us strength to help others. We want every bereaved family to know that you are not alone and that even in the darkest times, there is always light. Artem's words brought tears not only to Natalia, but also to many present. They realized that even in tragedy, one can find strength to move forward and help others. Oleksandra grew up, and every year Artem and Natalia saw a part of Mark in her. She became their bright light that lit the way even on the darkest days. Their joint project, Wings of Mark, helped hundreds of families find hope and support. Although their lives were marked by pain and loss, Artem and Natalia were able to find meaning in their story. They accepted the past, learned to live with it, and created a future full of love, understanding, and compassion. Their path was not easy, but it showed them the main thing. Even after the deepest losses, you can find a new meaning and start again. And while Mark remained in their hearts, their love for Oleksandra and helping others became their greatest legacy.